Welcome, fellow sleepyheads and seekers of knowledge and rest, to a journey through history's darker corridors. For the next hour, we'll explore the lives of tyrants, murderers, and madmen who terrorized Europe during the Middle Ages. Whether you're here to learn something new before sleep finds you, or simply to let these historical tales wash over you like a medieval lullaby, you're in the right place. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's begin our tour through the medieval world's most villainous characters. Close your eyes if you wish. These stories will paint their own pictures in your mind as we journey together through the darker pages of history. Let's begin. Andronikos I Komnenos, 1118 to 1185. Byzantine Emperor from 1183 to 1185, Andronikos was born into the noble Komnenos family, but became one of the most despised rulers of medieval Byzantium. Known for his violent temper and paranoid disposition, he came to power after overthrowing his nephew Alexios II in a bloody coup. His reign was characterized by extreme brutality toward both nobles and commoners alike. Andronikos systematically executed members of his own family whom he suspected of disloyalty, including children and elderly relatives. He established a reign of terror in Constantinople, using torture and public executions to maintain control. His particular cruelty toward the Latin population of the city earned him widespread hatred. Andronikos was known to personally participate in torture sessions, showing sadistic pleasure in the suffering of his victims. His paranoia grew increasingly severe, leading to mass arrests and executions based on mere suspicion. The emperor's erratic behavior and violent outbursts terrorized his court, where no one felt safe from his wrath. His reign ended when the people of Constantinople rose against him in 1185, capturing him and subjecting him to the same brutal treatment he'd inflicted on others. He was tortured for days before finally being killed by the angry mob. Arnaud Amaury died 1225. A Cistercian abbot and papal legate, Arnaud Amaury became the architect of one of medieval Europe's most horrific religious persecutions. Born into French nobility, he initially served as abbot of Poblet and later Citeaux, before being appointed by Pope Innocent III to lead the conversion efforts against the Cathars in southern France. When peaceful conversion failed, Amaury became the driving force behind the Albigensian Crusade, transforming from a man of God into an instrument of mass murder. His most infamous moment came during the sack of Béziers in 1209, when soldiers asked how to distinguish between Catholic and Cathar residents. Amaury reportedly replied, "Kill them all, for the Lord knows those that are his own," a phrase that evolved into the modern saying, "Kill them all and let God sort them out." Under his leadership, entire cities were massacred, with estimates suggesting over 20,000 people died at Béziers alone. Amaury showed particular enthusiasm for burning suspected heretics alive, considering it purification by fire. He systematically destroyed the rich culture of Occitania, ordering the burning of books, destruction of libraries, and elimination of troubadour traditions. His methods were so extreme that even contemporary chroniclers, accustomed to medieval violence, expressed shock at his brutality. Arnaud de Cervole, the archpriest, 1300 to 1366. Known as the archpriest, Arnaud de Cervole was one of medieval Europe's most notorious mercenary leaders and extortionists. Originally trained for the priesthood at Velines, hence his nickname, he abandoned religious life for the more lucrative career of professional warfare. After the Battle of Poitiers in 1356, when the French crown's authority collapsed, Arnaud recognized the opportunity to operate with impunity. He formed the first great company of mercenaries a massive band of soldiers who had been dismissed after various peace treaties but refused to disband. Under Arnaud's leadership, this army of several thousand men devastated southern France, particularly the previously untouched region of Provence. His business model was simple but effective: occupy a wealthy town or region, then demand enormous payments to leave. The archpriest was a master of psychological warfare, using his men to commit calculated atrocities that would terrorize other settlements into compliance. In his most audacious act, he surrounded the papal seat at Avignon in 1358, essentially taking the Pope hostage and demanding 20,000 florins for the privilege of leaving the area unmolested. This act shocked medieval Europe, as attacking the Pope was considered one of the gravest sins possible. Arnaud's companies operated like mobile kingdoms, complete with their own judicial systems and economic structures. Attila the Hun, 406 to 453. Known to his enemies as the Scourge of God, Attila was the ruler of the Hunnic Empire who terrorized Europe for over 2 decades during the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. Born into the royal family of the Huns, a nomadic people from the steppes of Central Asia, Attila inherited a kingdom that already controlled vast territories from the Ural River to the Rhine. However, it was his personal ambition and military genius that transformed the Huns from raiders into an existential threat to civilization itself. Attila ruled through a combination of tactical brilliance and psychological terrorism, understanding that fear could be more effective than actual conquest. His armies were known for their mobility and savagery, appearing suddenly to devastate entire regions before disappearing like a plague of locusts. The Hunnic king took particular pleasure in destroying symbols of Roman civilization. Libraries, temples, aqueducts, and monuments were systematically demolished. Attila's reputation for cruelty was legendary, even in an age of routine violence. Prisoners were often tortured in elaborate ways, while entire populations were enslaved or massacred as examples to others. His negotiation tactics involved sending envoys carrying the heads of previous ambassadors who had displeased him. Cities that surrendered immediately might be spared, but those that resisted faced complete destruction. Contemporary accounts describe Attila as a man who took personal satisfaction in human suffering, often presiding over mass executions while feasting. Cesare Borgia, 1475 to 1507. The illegitimate son of Pope Alexander VI, Cesare Borgia epitomized the corruption and violence of Renaissance Italy, while technically falling within the medieval period's end. Born Cesare Borgia into the infamous Borgia family, he was originally destined for the church, becoming a cardinal at age 18 through his father's influence. However, after his brother Juan's mysterious murder, which many suspected Cesare orchestrated, he abandoned his ecclesiastical career to become a secular prince and military commander. Cesare's methods were so ruthlessly effective that Niccolò Machiavelli used him as the primary inspiration for The Prince. He conquered much of central Italy through a combination of military skill, political cunning, and sheer brutality. Cesare was known to personally strangle his enemies, and rumours persisted of his involvement in numerous assassinations, including potentially poisoning guests at dinner parties. His relationship with his sister Lucrezia was the subject of persistent incest rumours, adding scandal to his already dark reputation. Cesare established a network of spies and assassins throughout Italy, eliminating rivals through methods ranging from outright warfare to subtle poisoning. He showed particular creativity in disposing of enemies. Some were thrown from castle walls, others were slowly poisoned over months, and several simply disappeared entirely. His court was described as a place where beautiful courtesans mingled with professional killers and where loyalty was maintained through a careful balance of rewards and terror. Charles II of Navarre, Charles the Bad, 1332 to 1387. Earning his nickname through decades of treachery, murder and political manipulation, Charles II of Navarre was one of medieval Europe's most unreliable and dangerous nobles. Born into the royal house of Évreux, he inherited the kingdom of Navarre and substantial holdings in Normandy, but his ambitions extended far beyond his legitimate territories. Charles spent his entire adult life attempting to expand his power through betrayal, assassination, and playing all sides in the 100 Years' War. He began his career in treachery by murdering Charles de la Cerda, the Constable of France, and favourite of King John II, in a particularly brutal knife attack that shocked even medieval sensibilities. This act led to his exile, but rather than reform, Charles began a systematic campaign of switching sides between France and England whenever it suited his purposes. His betrayals were legendary. He would sign treaties with France while secretly negotiating with England, accept bribes from both sides, and then attack whichever ally seemed more vulnerable. Charles's political machinations contributed significantly to the devastation of France during the 100 Years' War, as his constant betrayals prevented effective defence against English invasions. He was suspected of attempting to poison the French Dauphin, and was definitely involved in multiple assassination plots against French nobles. His death in 1387 was seen as divine justice. While being treated for an illness with brandy-soaked bandages, a servant's candle ignited the cloth, burning him alive in agony that lasted several days. Christian II of Denmark, Christian the Tyrant, 1481 to 1559. Ruling Norway and Denmark from 1513 to 1523, Christian II earned his epithet through a reign characterized by extreme brutality, paranoid persecution, and shocking disregard for human life. Born into Danish royalty, Christian initially showed promise as an intelligent and cultured prince, but his mental state deteriorated rapidly once he gained power. His most infamous act was the Stockholm bloodbath of 1520, where he invited Swedish nobility to his coronation as King of Sweden, only to arrest and execute over 80 nobles, bishops, and prominent citizens in a 3-day orgy of violence. Christian's justification for this massacre was that these men were heretics and traitors, but contemporary accounts suggest he simply wanted to eliminate potential opposition to his rule. His methods of execution were particularly cruel. Some victims were beheaded, others were hanged, and several were subjected to elaborate tortures before death. The Danish king showed signs of severe paranoia, constantly suspecting plots against his life, and responding with increasingly harsh measures. He implemented a system of spies and informants that terrorized his subjects, encouraging denunciations and rewarding false accusations. Christian's taxation policies were ruinously oppressive, designed more to demonstrate his absolute power than to fund legitimate government needs. He took particular pleasure in humiliating traditional nobles, forcing them to perform menial labour or subjecting them to public mockery. His reign created such misery that even his own supporters eventually turned against him, leading to his deposition and eventual imprisonment. Eustace the Monk, 1170 to 1217. Born Eustace Busket, this former Benedictine monk became one of the most feared pirates and mercenaries of the early 13th century, earning a reputation so fearsome that many believed he possessed supernatural powers. Originally serving as a monk at Saumur Abbey in northern France, Eustace abandoned religious life after a family property dispute led to his excommunication. He fled to the English Channel, where his knowledge of navigation and coastal geography made him invaluable as a maritime mercenary. Eustace's piratical career began in service to King John of England, who hired his fleet to capture the Channel Islands and conduct raids against French shipping. The former monk proved exceptionally skilled at naval warfare, using innovative tactics and showing particular brutality toward prisoners. His reputation for cruelty grew as stories spread of his habit of throwing captives overboard or leaving them to starve on isolated rocks. When Eustace switched sides to serve King Philip Augustus of France in 1212, he brought his formidable skills to bear against his former English employers. His knowledge of English coastal defences made him particularly dangerous, and he conducted devastating raids along the southern English coast. The pirate monk showed a sadistic creativity in his attacks, often timing raids during religious festivals to maximize psychological impact. His fleet controlled shipping lanes in the Channel, essentially holding maritime commerce hostage to his demands. Contemporary chroniclers attributed magical powers to Eustace, claiming he could make his ships invisible or control the winds through sorcery. His end came during a massive naval battle in 1217, where he was found hiding in a ship's bilge and beheaded as a traitor to the king and a most wicked pirate. Fulk III Nera the Black, 970 to 1040. Count of Anjou from 987 until his death, Fulk III was nicknamed Nera, the Black, for both his dark complexion and his sinister reputation as one of medieval France's most violent and treacherous nobles. Born into the House of Ingleger, Fulk inherited not only vast territories, but also a tradition of warfare and political manipulation that he elevated to an art form. His reign was characterized by constant warfare with neighboring lords, systematic betrayal of allies, and shocking acts of personal violence. Fulk's most notorious act occurred in 999, when he discovered his first wife, Elizabeth of Vendôme, was having an affair with a knight. Rather than simply divorce or exile her, Fulk had Elizabeth burned alive while wearing her wedding dress, forcing the entire court to watch as she died in agony. This act established his reputation for extreme cruelty and sent a clear message about the consequences of crossing him. Despite his violence, Fulk was also deeply religious in the medieval fashion, making multiple pilgrimages to Jerusalem to seek forgiveness for his crimes. However, these spiritual journeys seemed only to refresh his capacity for evil, as he invariably returned to Anjou to commence new campaigns of conquest and brutality. Fulk was a master of castle building and siege warfare, constructing innovative fortifications that became models for military architecture throughout Europe. However, he used these advances primarily to terrorize his neighbors, conducting raids that devastated entire regions and left thousands homeless. His political strategies involved elaborate deceptions, forged documents, and assassination plots that eliminated rivals with ruthless efficiency. Geoffrey of Mandeville died 1144. Perhaps the most notorious opportunist of the English Civil War known as the Anarchy, Geoffrey of Mandeville was a Norman lord whose betrayals and atrocities made him a byword for treachery in medieval England. Born into minor nobility in Essex, Geoffrey used the succession crisis following Henry I's death to advance his position through a remarkable series of betrayals that shocked even his contemporaries. When Stephen of Blois claimed the throne, Geoffrey supported him and was rewarded with the earldom of Essex. However, when Empress Matilda arrived to press her competing claim, Geoffrey immediately switched sides, receiving from her virtual control over Essex and additional territories in Middlesex and Hertfordshire. Not content with these gains, Geoffrey then betrayed Matilda and returned to Stephen's camp, demanding even more lands and privileges for his renewed loyalty. This pattern of betrayal continued throughout the Civil War, with Geoffrey switching sides whenever he perceived an advantage. His treacheries were facilitated by his strategic control of key fortresses in East Anglia, which he used as bases for increasingly brutal raids against civilian populations. Geoffrey's men became notorious for their cruelty, burning villages, destroying crops, and murdering anyone who resisted their depredations. In 1143, King Stephen finally moved against Geoffrey, but the wily Earl escaped into the marshland of the Cambridgeshire Fens, where he established a virtual kingdom of bandits and outlaws. From his base on the Isle of Ely, Geoffrey conducted a reign of terror throughout East Anglia, his forces appearing without warning to pillage monasteries, rob merchants, and terrorize the countryside. Genghis Khan, 1162 to 1227. Born Temujin into a minor Mongol clan, the man who would become Genghis Khan transformed from a tribal leader into history's most successful conqueror and arguably its most systematic destroyer of civilizations. Through a combination of military genius, psychological warfare, and absolute ruthlessness, he created the largest contiguous land empire in human history, stretching from Eastern Europe to the Pacific Ocean. Genghis Khan's approach to conquest was revolutionary in its systematic application of terror as a weapon of war. Cities that surrendered immediately might be spared, but those that resisted faced complete annihilation. His armies perfected the art of psychological warfare, often sparing a few survivors specifically to spread tales of Mongol brutality to other cities in their path. The Great Khan's military tactics included innovative siege techniques, superior cavalry tactics, and a communication system that allowed unprecedented coordination across vast distances. However, it was his willingness to commit genocide on an industrial scale that set him apart from other medieval conquerors. Entire populations were systematically slaughtered, with estimates suggesting that his conquest resulted in the deaths of over 40 million people. Genghis Khan took particular pleasure in destroying centers of learning and culture, viewing settled civilization as a weakness to be eliminated. Libraries were burned, irrigation systems were destroyed, and urban populations were either killed or enslaved. His psychological profile suggests a man who found genuine satisfaction in human suffering, often personally participating in the torture and execution of captured leaders. Gilles de Rais, 1404 to 1440. Marshal of France and companion in arms to Joan of Arc, Gilles de Rais represents one of history's most shocking falls from heroism to depravity. Born into Breton nobility and inheriting vast estates while still a child, Gilles initially distinguished himself as a military commander during the 100 Years' War, fighting alongside Joan of Arc in several key campaigns and earning recognition as one of France's greatest knights. However, after Joan's execution in 1431, Gilles retreated to his estates and began a descent into occultism, alchemy, and eventually mass murder that would earn him the distinction of possibly being history's first documented serial killer. Between 1432 and 1440, Gilles systematically tortured and murdered an estimated 80 to 200 children, primarily young boys aged between 6 and 18. His crimes were not random acts of violence, but carefully planned rituals that combined sexual sadism with occult practices. Gilles employed a network of servants and accomplices who helped him procure victims, typically promising employment or education to families struggling with poverty. The murders took place in various castles across his territories, with specially constructed chambers designed for torture and ritual killing. Contemporary accounts of his trial describe acts too horrific for medieval chroniclers to record in detail, with many portions of testimony being ordered stricken from official records. Gilles showed no remorse during his trial, confessing in graphic detail to his crimes and expressing only concern that his victims' souls might not reach heaven. His execution in 1440 was attended by thousands, many of whom had believed him to be a hero of France. Ivan IV, the Terrible, 1530 to 1584. The first Tsar of all the Russias, Ivan IV. Vasilievich earned his epithet Grozny, which means both terrible and awesome in Russian, through a reign that combined remarkable administrative achievements with shocking acts of cruelty and paranoid violence. Crowned as a child following his father's death, Ivan's early experiences of boyar conspiracies and palace intrigue shaped his adult paranoia and contributed to the development of one of history's most unstable personalities. His transformation from a promising young ruler into a psychopathic tyrant began around 1560, following the mysterious death of his beloved first wife, Anastasia Romanovna, whom he suspected has been poisoned by boyar conspirators. In response, Ivan established the Oprichnina, a state within the state controlled by black-clad security forces who terrorized the Russian nobility and peasantry alike. The Oprichniki, as these agents were known, were encouraged to commit acts of extreme violence, including mass executions, torture, and the systematic destruction of entire towns suspected of disloyalty. Ivan's most infamous act was the destruction of Novgorod in 1570, where his forces killed an estimated 60,000 civilians over 5 weeks of systematic slaughter. The Tsar personally participated in many of these atrocities, showing particular creativity in devising new methods of torture and execution. His violent temper was legendary. He once beat his pregnant daughter-in-law for wearing inappropriate clothing, causing her to miscarry, and when his son Ivan Ivanovich protested, the Tsar struck him with his iron-pointed staff, inflicting injuries that proved fatal. This act of filicide devastated Ivan and contributed to the succession crisis that would plague Russia for decades after his death. John Lackland, 1166 to 1216. King of England from 1199 to 1216, John earned his nickname Lackland as a prince due to his father Henry II's failure to provide him with significant territories, but he would prove that his true lack was of moral character rather than real estate. The youngest son of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine, John's path to the throne was paved with betrayal, first of his father and later of his nephew Arthur of Brittany, whom many considered the rightful heir. John's reign was characterized by military incompetence, financial extortion, and judicial corruption that eventually provoked his nobles to rebellion and forced him to sign the Magna Carta in 1215. His cruelty toward political opponents was systematic and creative. Prisoners were starved to death in dungeons, hostages were blinded or mutilated, and entire families were imprisoned to ensure the compliance of suspected dissidents. John's treatment of Arthur of Brittany remains one of medieval history's most controversial episodes, with most historians believing the king murdered his 16-year-old nephew with his own hands after a dinner at Rouen Castle in 1203. The king's paranoia led him to maintain an extensive network of spies and informants, creating an atmosphere of terror among his nobles that ultimately proved counterproductive. John's financial demands were ruinously oppressive, involving arbitrary taxes, confiscated estates, and the systematic selling of royal justice to the highest bidder. His personal involvement in judicial proceedings often resulted in verdicts that reflected his personal animosities rather than legal precedent. The king was also notorious for his treatment of noble families, often seizing wives and daughters as hostages and subjecting them to imprisonment in harsh conditions. Momcilo died 1345. Known as Hajduke Momcilo, this Bulgarian warlord and bandit leader became one of the most dangerous and unpredictable figures in the Byzantine Empire's final centuries. Rising from peasant origins in the Rhodop Mountains, Momcilo built a personal army of displaced farmers, former soldiers and career criminals who terrorized the borderlands between Bulgaria, Byzantium and Serbia. His career flourished during the chaotic period of Byzantine civil wars, when central authority collapsed and local strongmen could operate with virtual impunity. Momcilo's genius lay in his ability to exploit the political instability of the region, playing all sides against each other while building his own independent power base. He served briefly under Stefan Dušan of Serbia, but quickly realized that his opportunities for advancement and enrichment were greater as an independent operator. His switching of sides during the Byzantine Civil War of 1341 to 1347 was so frequent and shameless that even contemporary chroniclers, accustomed to medieval political cynicism, expressed amazement at his treachery. In 1343 alone, Momcilo changed allegiances 3 times, each betrayal accompanied by violence against his former allies and their civilian supporters. His method of warfare was particularly brutal, involving systematic destruction of crops, poisoning of wells, and the torture of prisoners to extract information about hidden wealth. Momcilo established his own legal system in the territories he controlled, creating a bizarre kingdom where banditry was elevated to a form of governance. His court at Perithiorion became a centre for criminals and political exiles from across the Balkans, creating a haven for every form of violence and criminality. The mere mention of his name was sufficient to empty villages and cause travellers to seek alternative routes through some of the most dangerous terrain in Europe. Owain Lawgoch, Red Hand, 1330 to 1378. The last legitimate male-line descendant of the royal house of Gwynedd, Owain ap Thomas ap Rhodri earned his epithet Lawgoch, Red Hand, through decades of warfare that made him one of the most feared military commanders of the 14th century. Born into the exiled Welsh nobility, Owain spent his adult life attempting to reclaim his ancestral throne through a combination of foreign mercenary service and direct invasion of Wales. His military reputation was built serving as a commander for the French crown during the 100 Years' War, where his tactical innovations and ruthless efficiency in battle made him invaluable to French military planners. Owain's company of Welsh mercenaries became notorious throughout Europe for their discipline, ferocity, and complete loyalty to their commander. However, it was his activities as a mercenary commander that earned him his fearsome reputation. His forces were known for taking no prisoners, systematically looting conquered territories, and showing particular cruelty toward English settlers in disputed regions. When not serving French interests, Owain led his own military campaigns against the established order, most notably his leadership of the Googlers. a massive mercenary army that invaded and devastated Switzerland in 1375. This campaign was marked by exceptional brutality, with Owain's forces burning cities, massacring civilian populations, and conducting systematic rape and pillage across the Swiss countryside. His strategic genius was matched by a complete absence of mercy toward defeated enemies. Captured nobles were held for ruinous ransoms, while common soldiers and civilians were often executed as examples. Owain's two attempts to invade Wales and reclaim his throne created panic throughout the English establishment, as his reputation for military excellence was matched only by his known cruelty toward English interests. Pedro I the Cruel, 1334 to 1369. King of Castile and Leon from 1350 to 1369, Pedro earned his epithet through a reign characterized by systematic torture, political assassination, and personal participation in acts of extreme violence that shocked even his medieval contemporaries. Born the legitimate son of Alfonso XI, Pedro's early experiences during his father's reign, which was marked by constant warfare and political instability, shaped his understanding that political power required the constant application of fear. His cruelty manifested early in his reign with his treatment of political opponents. Nobles who opposed his policies were not simply imprisoned or exiled, but subjected to elaborate tortures designed to serve as public examples. Pedro took personal pleasure in devising new methods of execution and torture, often presiding over these events while dining or conducting other court business. His paranoia extended to his own family, leading him to order the execution of his half-brothers and several cousins, whom he suspected of harbouring ambitions for the throne. The king's treatment of women was particularly notorious. He abandoned his French queen, Blanche of Bourbon, immediately after their wedding, keeping her imprisoned under harsh conditions for 8 years before finally having her murdered. His relationship with his mistress, Maria de Padilla, was marked by extreme jealousy that led to the deaths of several courtiers suspected of showing her attention. Pedro's judicial system became a mechanism for personal vengeance rather than legal justice, with verdicts determined by his personal likes and dislikes rather than evidence or precedent. His wars with neighbouring kingdoms were conducted with exceptional brutality, involving the systematic destruction of civilian populations and the use of terror as a primary military tactic. Raynald de Châtillon, 1125 to 1187. Prince of Antioch and later Lord of Carac, Raynald de Châtillon embodied the worst aspects of Crusader mentality, combining religious fanaticism with personal cruelty and political opportunism that made him one of the most hated figures in the medieval Middle East. Originally a minor French nobleman who joined the Second Crusade, Raynald remained in the Holy Land where his marriage to Constance of Antioch elevated him to princely status. However, rather than serving as a responsible guardian of Christian interests in the region, Raynald used his position to conduct increasingly brutal and counterproductive military campaigns that undermined Crusader security. His attack on Cyprus in 1155 to 1156 was marked by exceptional cruelty, even by medieval standards. His forces systematically tortured Orthodox Christian clergy, raped nuns, and engaged in wanton destruction of religious sites. When the Byzantine Emperor John Komnenos arrived with a superior force to demand satisfaction, Raynald was forced to prostrate himself publicly and beg forgiveness, an humiliation that only intensified his subsequent brutality. After his marriage to Stephanie de Milly made him Lord of Carac, Raynald established his castle as a base for raids against Muslim pilgrimage caravans travelling to Mecca, breaking multiple truces and provoking retaliatory attacks that devastated the Crusader kingdoms. His most provocative act was his attempt to launch a naval expedition to attack Mecca itself, an act of sacrilege that outraged the entire Muslim world. Raynald showed particular creativity in torturing prisoners, often devising elaborate methods designed to extract maximum suffering while serving as psychological warfare against his enemies. His reputation for breaking oaths and violating truces made him a diplomatic liability, as Muslim leaders refused to negotiate with other Crusader nobles while Raynald remained at large. Robert FitzHubert died 1140. A Flemish mercenary whose brief career in England during the anarchy became legendary for its sheer audacity and cruelty, Robert FitzHubert represented the worst aspects of the foreign sellswords who flooded England during the civil war between Stephen and Matilda. Arriving in England in 1139 as part of King Stephen's Flemish mercenary contingent, Robert quickly demonstrated that his loyalty extended only to his own advancement, and that no oath or agreement could restrain his ambitions. Rather than serving faithfully under Stephen's command, Robert immediately struck out on his own, conducting a lightning assault on Malmesbury Castle that demonstrated both tactical brilliance and complete disregard for the rules of warfare. When Stephen's forces expelled him from Malmesbury, Robert simply switched sides and offered his services to Empress Matilda, beginning a pattern of betrayal that would characterize his entire career. However, even Matilda's supporters found Robert's methods too extreme. He showed no discrimination in his targets, attacking churches, monasteries, and civilian settlements with equal enthusiasm. His raid on Devizes Castle, conducted through a surprise night attack that violated contemporary rules of warfare, established him as the master of a sizable territory between Winchester and London. Robert's dream of carving out an independent kingdom led him to summon additional mercenaries from Flanders, creating a growing army of foreign soldiers who owed allegiance to no English authority. His forces became notorious for their systematic destruction of English communities, burning crops, slaughtering livestock, and driving peasant populations into starvation and homelessness. The mercenaries' complete contempt for English laws and customs made him a symbol of foreign oppression that transcended the political divisions of the Civil War. Roger de Flor, 1267 to 1305. Originally a member of the Knights Templar, Roger de Flor's expulsion from the Order for disgraceful conduct at the Siege of Acre marked the beginning of a career that would make him one of medieval Europe's most notorious mercenary commanders. Born the son of a German falconer in the service of Frederick II, Roger's early life was marked by poverty and social ambition that would drive his later excesses. His disgrace at Acre came when he commandeered a Templar galley during the city's fall, charging desperate civilians enormous fees to evacuate them to safety in Cyprus, while abandoning fellow Templars to their fate. This act of cowardice and profiteering established a pattern of behaviour that would characterise his entire subsequent career. After his expulsion from the Templars, Roger briefly operated as an independent pirate in the Mediterranean, preying on Christian and Muslim shipping with equal enthusiasm. His transition to legitimate military service came with his recruitment of the Catalan Company, a massive mercenary force composed of unemployed soldiers from the recently concluded War of the Sicilian Vespers. Roger's genius lay in recognizing that these battle-hardened veterans could be organized into a professional military force capable of challenging established powers. His contract with the Byzantine Empire seemed to offer an opportunity for legitimate service, but Roger quickly demonstrated that his primary interests lay in personal enrichment and territorial conquest rather than serving his employers faithfully. The Catalan Company's campaigns in Asia Minor were marked by systematic looting of Byzantine territory and open conflict with imperial forces, revealing Roger's true intentions to carve out an independent kingdom. His negotiations with various Turkish leaders suggested a willingness to betray his Christian employers for personal advantage, behaviour that ultimately led to his assassination by Byzantine officials who recognised the threat he represented. Seguin de Badefol died 1366. One of the most successful and feared mercenary commanders of the 14th century, Seguin de Badefol transformed the aftermath of military defeat into an opportunity for creating one of medieval Europe's most destructive criminal enterprises. Originally serving as a mercenary for King John II of France, Seguin's career took a decisive turn after the French defeat at the Battle of Poitiers in 1356, when the collapse of royal authority left thousands of professional soldiers without employment or supervision. Rather than accepting dismissal and returning to peaceful occupations, Seguin organised these veterans into the Margot, one of the largest and most disciplined criminal organisations in medieval Europe. Under his leadership, this band of up to 2,000 heavily armed and experienced soldiers operated as a mobile kingdom, complete with its own military hierarchy, judicial system, and economic structure based on systematic extortion. Seguin's innovation was the development of a sophisticated protection racket that targeted entire cities and regions. His forces would occupy strategic positions around a wealthy community, then offer to leave in exchange for enormous payments, while simultaneously demonstrating their capacity for destruction through selective acts of violence. His greatest triumph came in 1362, when he united various mercenary bands into the Great Company and defeated a royal French army at the Battle of Brignais, effectively establishing mercenary control over large portions of eastern France. This victory demonstrated that organised criminality could successfully challenge legitimate government authority, inspiring similar enterprises throughout Europe. Seguin's personal involvement in violence was legendary. He participated in torture sessions, personally conducted negotiations while displaying severed heads of previous victims, and took evident pleasure in the fear his reputation inspired. Sviatopolk I, the Accursed, 980 to 1019. Grand Prince of Kiev from 1015 to 1019, Sviatopolk earned his epithet the Accursed through a series of fratricidal murders that shocked even the violence-accustomed medieval world and established him as one of the most reviled figures in early Russian history. The son of Yaropolk III, and later adopted son of Vladimir the Fair, Sviatopolk's path to power was complicated by the complex succession traditions of Kievan Rus, where multiple princes had legitimate claims to various territories within the realm. However, rather than accepting a subordinate role or seeking to build consensus among his brothers, Sviatopolk chose a path of systematic murder that would eliminate his rivals and concentrate power in his hands alone. His most notorious acts were the assassinations of his half-brothers Boris and Gleb, both of whom had accepted Christian teachings and chose not to resist his aggression, making them martyrs in Orthodox Christian tradition. The murders were conducted with particular cruelty. Boris was stabbed repeatedly by hired assassins while praying in his tent, while Gleb was killed by his own cook, who had been bribed by Sviatopolk's agents. These killings were followed by the murder of another brother, Sviatoslav, completing Sviatopolk's campaign of fratricidal violence. His brief reign was characterized by the systematic elimination of potential rivals, oppressive taxation designed to fund his personal security forces, and the creation of an atmosphere of terror among the nobility of Kiev. Sviatopolk's paranoia extended to ordering the deaths of boyars whose loyalty he questioned, often based on mere rumours or personal animosity rather than evidence of actual treachery. His political methods relied heavily on hired assassins, torture, and the public display of victims as warnings to other potential opponents. Tomás de Torquemada, 1420–1498. Dominican friar and first Grand Inquisitor of Spain, Tomás de Torquemada became the architect of one of history's most systematic campaigns of religious persecution, transforming the Spanish Inquisition into an instrument of terror that would operate for over 3 centuries. Born into a converso family, Christians of Jewish ancestry, Torquemada's own background added a particularly sinister dimension to his later persecution of converted Jews, whom he suspected of secretly practicing their original faith. His appointment as Grand Inquisitor by the Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, gave him unprecedented authority to investigate, torture, and execute anyone suspected of heresy throughout the Spanish kingdoms. Under Torquemada's leadership, the Inquisition developed sophisticated methods of investigation that relied heavily on denunciation, torture, and the confiscation of property from accused heretics. His personal involvement in the development of torture techniques and interrogation procedures demonstrated a scholarly approach to the infliction of suffering that was particularly disturbing to contemporary observers. Torquemada authored detailed instructions for the use of torture, specifying the precise methods to be employed against different categories of suspects and the duration of suffering that could be inflicted without technically violating church law. His establishment of the Quemadero burning place in Seville created a permanent facility for public executions that served both practical and psychological purposes, demonstrating the Inquisition's power while terrorizing potential heretics. The Grand Inquisitor's personal asceticism and apparent religious sincerity made his cruelty even more disturbing, as he seemed genuinely to believe that torture and execution were acts of divine service. His role in convincing Ferdinand and Isabella to expel all Jews from Spain in 1492 represented the culmination of his campaign to create religious uniformity through violence and persecution. Vlad III the Impaler, 1431–1476. Prince of Wallachia and the historical inspiration for Count Dracula, Vlad III. Dracula earned his epithet through his systematic use of impalement as both a method of execution and a psychological weapon that terrorized his enemies and subjects alike. Born into the noble house of Draculesht during a period when Wallachia was contested between the Ottoman Empire, Hungary, and local boyar factions, Vlad's early experiences as a hostage in the Ottoman court shaped his understanding of power as something maintained through constant displays of extreme violence. His 3 separate reigns as Prince of Wallachia were marked by increasingly elaborate acts of cruelty designed to eliminate political opposition and deter foreign invasion through sheer terror. Vlad's signature method of execution involved impaling victims on sharpened stakes, positioning them so that death would be slow and agonizing, often taking hours or even days. Contemporary accounts describe forests of impaled corpses surrounding his capital, with the prince dining among these displays while conducting court business. His cruelty extended beyond military necessity to encompass a systematic campaign against social order itself. merchants who cheated customers, unfaithful wives, lazy peasants, and corrupt officials were all subjected to elaborate tortures designed to serve as public examples. Vlad's psychological warfare techniques included sending envoys to enemy courts, carrying bags containing the severed noses and ears of captured soldiers, and conducting diplomatic negotiations while seated among freshly impaled prisoners. His most infamous act was the dinner party, where he had his boyar enemies locked in a hall and burned alive, then used their estates to reward loyal supporters. William I, the Bad of Sicily, 1131 to 1166. King of Sicily from 1154 to 1166, William I earned his epithet the Bad through a reign characterized by systematic oppression, brutal suppression of rebellions, and personal involvement in acts of torture that shocked even medieval chroniclers accustomed to royal violence. Inheriting the Norman kingdom of Sicily from his father, Roger II, William initially faced multiple challenges to his authority from both Muslim and Christian populations within his diverse realm. However, rather than seeking accommodation or building consensus, William chose to rule through fear and intimidation, establishing a reign of terror that would define his entire monarchy. His response to the rebellion of 1160 to 1161 revealed the full extent of his cruelty. Captured rebels were subjected to systematic torture, designed not merely to extract information, but to serve as public entertainment for the royal court. William took personal pleasure in devising new methods of execution, often combining elements of Norman, Arabic, and Byzantine traditions to create particularly elaborate spectacles of suffering. His treatment of the Muslim population of Sicily involved systematic persecution designed to force conversion or emigration, including the destruction of mosques, prohibition of Islamic practices, and the sale of Muslim children into slavery. The king's paranoia extended to his own Christian nobles, whom he suspected of treasonous communication with foreign powers or rival claimants to his throne. His network of spies and informants created an atmosphere of mutual suspicion that paralyzed normal court life and government administration. William's judicial system became a mechanism for personal vengeance rather than legal justice, with verdicts predetermined by his personal animosities and sentences designed to maximize public suffering. Vseslav of Polotsk, the Sorcerer, 1039 to 1101. Prince of Polotsk and briefly Grand Prince of Kiev, Vseslav Bresislavich became a figure of terror throughout the early Russian principalities, earning a reputation for supernatural powers that made him the subject of folklore depicting him as a werewolf or sorcerer. His career began with systematic raids against neighbouring principalities, but unlike typical medieval warfare, Vseslav's campaigns were marked by particular cruelty toward civilian populations and a seeming delight in destruction for its own sake. His burning of Novgorod in 1066 was conducted with such thorough brutality that contemporary chroniclers described it as the work of demons rather than human warriors. Vseslav's forces were known for their systematic destruction of religious sites, their torture of captured priests, and their deliberate targeting of women and children as psychological warfare tactics. His capture and imprisonment in 1067 seemed to end his career, but his dramatic escape during the Kiev uprising of 1068 and subsequent declaration as Grand Prince added to his supernatural reputation. During his brief reign in Kiev, Vseslav demonstrated administrative cruelty that matched his military brutality, implementing systems of taxation and justice designed more to terrorize the population than to fund legitimate government. His return to Polotsk in 1061 marked the beginning of 3 decades, during which he transformed his principality into a base for systematic raiding and pillaging that devastated much of the region between the Dnieper and Dvina rivers. The persistence of folklore depicting Vseslav as a shapeshifter who could transform into a wolf reflects the psychological impact of his cruelty on the medieval Russian imagination, where his human form seemed insufficient to explain the extent of his evil. And so ends our journey through the shadows of medieval history. We've met tyrants and murderers, mercenaries and madmen, 42 villains whose dark deeds echo across the centuries. Thank you for joining me tonight. If you enjoyed this medieval tour of villainy, consider subscribing for more historical journeys designed for the sleepless mind. Until next time, sleep well, and may your dreams be filled with knights and castles